Hello, welcome to Washington Talk. I'm Connie Kim, and we're back after a month-long break. The world is staggering under the multifaceted impact from the coronavirus. North Korea and 7 other countries have called for sanctions suspension to respond to the pandemic. The UN panel of experts report on North Korea point out to the country's flagrant sanctions violation. Are calls for easing sanctions in the face of the pandemic appropriate? Joining us today is Daniel Russel, Vice President for International Security and Diplomacy at the Asia Society Policy Institute. He also served as the Assistant Secretary of State for East Asian and Pacific Affairs in the Obama administration. And Scott Snyder, Senior Fellow for Korea Studies and Director of the Program on U.S.-Korea Policy at the Council on Foreign Relations. His book, South Korea at the Crossroads, charts the evolution of Seoul's foreign policy and strategic choices. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Glad to be here.
There are more than 2.7 million coronavirus cases around the world, and yet North Korea continues to say there are 0 patients in the country. Mr. Snyder, what do you make of this claim?
Well, it's an illustration of how North Korea really wants to hide potential vulnerabilities. And the limited access and limited statistical data that is available to the outside actually assists in North Korea keeping up this fiction that they don't have coronavirus cases.
And the UN panel of experts report point out that North Korea continued to violate a wide range of sanctions, earning hundreds of millions of dollars in illicit funds for the regime. What does this tell you about North Korea's sanctions violations and patterns, Mr. Russell?
Well, it tells me that the North Koreans have shown a great deal of resilience and imagination in finding ways to circumvent the UN sanctions. They rely on partnerships with Chinese business people, smugglers, and we've seen the ship-to-ship transfer of oil and so on that was reported in the panel of expert report. But we also see an increasing reliance and increasing ingenuity in the cyber realm. Kim Jong-un has created an army of hackers and is using that to steal money, cryptocurrency, and so on in a very, very serious way. This is a concern that I flagged in a report that the Asia Society put out last year on North Korea's next scenarios, future scenarios, beyond just ballistic missiles and nuclear weapons.
So North Korea's cyber hacking activities have been pinpointed in the report, but also notably in the report is China's continued violations, especially in the ship-to-ship transfers front. So why do you think China continues to be less compliant in implementing sanctions here?
Well, I think that it's related to a shift in China's policy following the advent of symmetry between President Trump and Chairman Kim. And really what that has done is to cause China to revert to its old approach of treating North Korea as a strategic asset and using it as a buffer. And so what that has meant is that China, while mouthing its adherence to UN Security Council sanctions, increasingly has become a behind-the-scenes enabler, really almost an overt flouter of the UN sanctions, because most of these ship-to-ship transfers are occurring very close to military installations on the Chinese coast.
Connie, I think Scott is making a really important point here. I visited the North Korea-China border in December of 2017 and found that the Chinese officials and business people were really taking quite seriously the sanctions. We're beginning to crack down quite hard on smuggling. But after Trump and Kim Jong-un became best friends in Singapore, all bets were off. And when the U.S. abandoned what was a common strategy to apply pressure to North Korea in tandem with China, and instead attempted to make a bilateral deal with North Korea, China became very worried and couldn't at that point risk taking a harder line with North Korea than the U.S. did. So Beijing softened its stance towards sanctions, as Scott pointed out, in order to maintain influence with Pyongyang.
I just want to pick up on that point, Mr. Snyder. I'll address this question to you. So there has been criticism, like Mr. Russell said, that the U.S.'s maximum pressure campaign has weakened, thus leading to the momentum to push other countries to implement sanctions. That momentum has been lost. Do you agree with that criticism?
Well, I think that there has been lost momentum. Part of that is because of the symmetry. Part of it is because of President Trump's distraction and focus on other issues.
And the U.S. did call on China to address coal and oil smuggling activities for China to do more. So is China going to do more, and what can they do more?
In terms of actually implementing sanctions, well, China needs to stop being an enabler of North Korea's sanctions evasion. But the key to that is a revision of China's strategic perspective related to North Korea, and actually a strengthening of adherence by China to the Security Council resolutions that it signed up for in the first place.
Connie, if I could add, I'd just say, if the question is what can China do to shut this down, the leadership in Beijing could shut down ship-to-ship transfers and other forms of smuggling in a heartbeat. We've seen that, and as I mentioned, saw that with my own eyes. That's a very different question from what will they do. I think that we should expect China to deny the accusations as it has, to ignore the U.S. request for real enforcement of the sanctions, because Beijing wants to keep the DPRK regime intact and wants to keep them dependent on China.
And on the sanctions front, we've seen 8 countries, including North Korea, Venezuela, Cuba, asking for sanctions suspension to respond to the pandemic. So how do you assess these calls to temporarily lift sanctions to respond to the coronavirus?
Well, look, the sanctions are in place not to harm the people of North Korea, but in response to the decisions by the North Korean leadership, and that the leadership is the target of the sanctions, first of all. But secondly, the sanctions are designed in a manner to try to ensure that humanitarian assistance can get through. And the fact of the matter is, Connie, that if North Korea would allow even a modest amount of monitoring in order to ensure that the assistance wound up with the people in need, as opposed to winding up in the cupboards of the Korean People's Army or of the elite, the international community would be prepared to do much, much more.
So on that point, the U.S.'s stance on humanitarian assistance is that the U.S. sanctions do not hinder legitimate aid for humanitarian aid purposes. But yet we've seen the Treasury Department change regulations to make it easier for aid groups to bring in aid-related items to North Korea for humanitarian aid purposes. So why do you think this measure was made?
Well, I think in part that is an effort to try to make clear that the U.S. sanctions approach is really focused on the state rather than the people. And I think that the U.S. Treasury efforts also respond to some complaints among humanitarian organizations that in particular implementation of financial sanctions has had the unintended impact of impeding humanitarian operations. So I think what's interesting is that the U.S. government has moved relatively quickly to try to remove obstacles to humanitarian aid in the context of COVID-19 at the same time that the North Koreans have tried to keep the door shut.
So if we look at the big picture of North Korea, currently sanctions are still in place, and North Korea's trade data, North Korea's export to China last month has hit an all-time low due to shutting down its borders with China. And we did hear North Korea say that it's going to push forward with its self-reliant economy. How do you think North Korea is going to pursue this promise that they made last year?
Well, speaking from my perspective, I don't believe that North Korea ever has been economically self-reliant. Juche is a slogan, it's an aspiration. It's never been realized, and frankly, I don't think that it ever will. I think we should expect North Korea to continue stealing from other countries, as we discussed in the cyber realm. I think we should expect North Korea to keep trying to get whatever it can from China, and more worrisomely, continue trying to extort South Korea, Japan, the United States, using threats, using provocations. That's been a consistent pattern. And frankly, the day that Donald Trump tweeted about falling in love with Kim Jong-un was the day that the international pressure of sanctions on North Korea began to weaken.
Mm-hmm.
So the really interesting question here is whether North Korea's self-imposed efforts at quarantine may actually have greater unintended consequences than the externally imposed effort to try to enforce sanctions on North Korea. And so I think that what we're all looking for is what is actually happening internally in the internal economy of North Korea. What sort of distress are they facing? And I think that we do see from the beginning of the year, already evidence of distress that is reflected in North Korea's calls for self-reliance. But this is a new pressure, and so we need to watch carefully evidences of distress economically that North Korea might be facing.
Mm-hmm. And we've seen a lot of media focus this week on Chairman Kim Jong-un's grave health conditions. Mr. Russell, when you were in government, we've heard a lot of potential reports of Kim Jong-un's ill health as well. So why is it so hard to verify these kind of information coming out from North Korea?
Well, Connie, it was true. It's true for Kim Jong-un. It was also true for Kim Jong-il. I remember protracted rumors about Kim Jong-il falling off a white horse and dying or being gravely injured or being in a car accident and so on. Look, North Korea has extraordinarily strict controls on information, particularly sensitive information. And there's probably no more sensitive information than the health and the whereabouts of the leader. So, that sort of naturally invites speculation and, in some cases, disinformation from outside, from South Korea and elsewhere. And it can take quite a while for a rumor to be confirmed or disproved. But if we've learned anything over time, it's not to jump to conclusions. Wait for some evidence.
Mr. Snyder, Mr. Russell did point out this fact a little bit, but the health of a country's leader is very important, is of a lot of interest. But why are media reports of Kim Jong-un's health of so much significance? And what is the media's focus here, Mr. Snyder?
Well, the focus on the leader is natural in part. It's created by the DPRK state media's own effort to place the leader as central to all affairs of the nation. And of course, who is the leader matters, but I think that the other thing that we need to pay attention to is the fact that there is an institutional infrastructure controlled by the leader and designed to perpetuate Kim family leadership that has been put into place and that has now managed two succession processes. And so I think that in addition to the leader, we also have to watch carefully whether or not there is any kind of evidence of breakdown in terms of the institutional processes that are designed to support the Kim leadership.
Due to so much secrets kept from the country, it's really hard to tell what kind of information is correct coming out from the regime. We'll have to see what the country comes out with going forward. Well, thank you so much, Mr. Russell and Mr. Snyder, for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you. That does it for Washington Talk. Please do join us again next week for more analysis on North Korea. I'm Connie Kim.